You're listening to Impulse to Innovation. The Institution of Mechanical Engineers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Helen Mees. As a global community of mechanical engineers with over 120,000 members in 140 countries, the Institution of Mechanical Engineers has been at the heart of the engineering profession since 1847. The institution's mission is to improve the world through engineering by sharing the latest news, views and insight into the creative world of technology and the people that make it happen. In part 2 of this episode on conservation engineering, Ian shares his thoughts on the value and legacy of the Heritage Awards and some of the ones that have had significant meaning to him, why the preservation of buildings such as our own Birdcage Walk are so important, and what his hopes are for the future of the heritage industry. Now, we're all feeling your passion as you're talking here today, Ian, and it's wonderful. But you don't just do this for a day job, do you? Your passion for heritage and conservation is also reflected in your active role within the Institution Heritage Committee, which you've mentioned a couple of times. So for those of our listeners who are not familiar with this committee, can you just tell us a little bit about it and what your role is?
The Engineering Heritage Committee was founded in 1984. And the first chair was Professor Isabel Pollock. And now we have chair is John Wood, both past presidents of IMechE. And it's been my privilege to work with both inspiring leaders, both inspiring engineers, and both really supportive of engineering heritage. I applied to the committee, having learned about it as a member. I applied and had a wonderful conversation with Professor Isabel Pollock, and she kindly invited me to join the committee, thinking that my background and my area of operation would add a bit more to the team, to the committee. And it's been, I'd say, it's been a privilege to work on that committee. What does the committee do? It celebrates our engineering heritage, primarily. That's what it does. And the awards celebrate the contribution of mechanical engineering in our past and our present. And that's a very important point. And what does it do? It recognises irreplaceable artefacts ranging from, say, submarines to sewage works, railway lines, aircraft, all sorts of amazing artefacts and many more between. And the awards, they raise public awareness of the vital role mechanical engineering plays in modern life. And I think that's important to remember as well. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier, is that some people often say that sort of looking back is comfortable. Being comfortable with your past is easy. Embracing the future is possibly more challenging, more demanding, and scary. But if you look back and see where we came from as engineers, if we look back from the pioneering days and apply that to where you are today, you can't look to the future unless you understand the past, because they do coexist. Yeah. You can't dismiss one and have the other. They are the same. So that's what we do. We are a conduit from IMechE, from Birdcage Walk, out to the wider community, whether it be Parliament, whether it be conservation community, whether it be wider community. We try to be that. We try to showcase industrial heritage, and we do that to try and inspire the next generation to become engineers. But also, we are very aware that many of our possibly senior members are connected to organisations who are running cultural heritage sites, industrial heritage sites, and we are there to support them as well. Yeah. Because we are very aware that, as we touched on earlier on, in some cases it's the older generation that are underpinning cultural heritage in industrial format, and we need to be there to assist them and provide that wider conversation. And as we both agreed, we both have a love for it. Many people have a love for it. It's how we help support, how we prop up, and how we move on as a family. That's what we do, and it's very rewarding. And we have a big reach. You know, we've had over 130, given more than 130 awards now since 1984. the awards, the collection is so diverse. And I would encourage members to maybe log on to the site and find out more, because there's going to be something in your area, something up your street that you might enjoy.
Well, we'll certainly put a link to the Heritage Committee's pages on the institution website. We'll put those into the notes for this podcast, so people can actually have a look and see what it's all about. I guess that there is one question I have to ask, and maybe this is a little tricky for you, but of the 130 plus Heritage Awards that you have given out, which one is your favourite one and why?
Oh, this is worse than Desert Island Discs. It's nearly impossible, Helen, to choose, because, I mean, it's an amazing, amazing array of projects, and some actually very close to my heart, so I have to be very careful how I choose. They're all amazing artefacts, all amazing projects, because they all represent everything that's good about mechanical engineering.
Yeah.
And they all encapsulate what we've just been talking about. That's it. That's what they do. That's what they are. That's why they exist, and that's why they get rewarded. I don't know. How could I not choose something like the old furnace in Coalbrookdale, the ironworks, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, and recipient of our 100th award? I mean, why could I not choose that? Or maybe locomotion number 1, actually driven by George Stephenson. In 1825, our first ever president. How could I resist that? Or perhaps, I don't know, the Falkirk Wheel for me, which celebrates wonderful engineering design, traditional functionality, where sort of art meets engineering. I mean, that for me is a incredible project. Every time I see it, I saw it quite recently, and again, it still has the same effect on me. It's a piece of engineering, it's a piece of kinetic art. It's working, it's providing a function, but it's so beautiful as well, which is what the Victorians did. It might have been functional, but aesthetically, it was next level. Maybe we ought to think about how that sits into society today. I don't know. I've been naughty, Helen. I've chosen 3.
Oh, okay.
I've chosen 3. And I've chosen these because Cragside, large property in Northumberland, home to Lord Armstrong, the most amazing engineer who had Elswick Works in Newcastle, 22,000 employees making ships and guns and all sorts of things. But it was the first house in the world to be lit by electricity derived from water power.
Yeah.
And I think that's a world-changing event. When you see how it was done, you see the location, when you see about the interrelationships between all the people at the time, Armstrong's love of hydroelectric power and hydroelectric power itself, fluid engineering, was something that he was, pioneered. I just think bring all those elements together in a household setting as a life-changing event. I thought for me is up there. It's off the scale. I've also chosen Kirkcaldy's material testing house in London. Maybe not an obvious choice for people.
Right.
I know Professor Pollock would love that, but it's the world's first engineering testing house, and it was exploring and improving material science.
Right.
It was at a time where we were building huge structures around the world and not really understanding the science behind the materials. We were acceptant that a piece of raw iron would perform a certain job, and a piece of raw iron, cast iron together would do something similar, but actually we're not knowing how it might fail. So there's this man, Kirkcaldy, came from a great lineage, great background, working with eminent engineers at the time. He decided, well, if I design a machine where I can test materials, maybe we can start to think about how we can make construction safer.
Yeah.
Which I think was a game-changing event, a bit like CNC many years later. And in fact, I was incredibly lucky to work with the founder's grandson, David Kirkcaldy. I worked with him for many years, and an amazing man. And I think also the building itself in Southwark Street in London, it has to have my most favourite saying, my most favourite maxim in the world, where above the doorway it says facts, not opinions. And I just think that That is just the most one, and it's still there today. You can see it. You walk alongside the street. And then my third choice would be Holland 1 submarine, which we did as a company. That was a job we completed for the Royal Navy Submarine Museum. And although that's very personal to me, from a conservation science point of view, it was an incredibly challenging project. But here you have a machine whereby they had the ability to marry the internal combustion engine with battery storage and motive power. And you put all that engineering into a steel tube that was only 7/16 thick, single skin, riveted together, and you submerge it. You put all that engineering and put it underwater. And that takes some doing. That takes some nerves in 1900, 1901. And submarine technology and everything surrounding submarines and submersibles and engineering underwater, it all comes from that. And I think that is an amazing step change as well. I mean, when you think that when John Philip Holland designed the submarine, he saw how efficient it was. He realized how effective it was underwater. And he wrote in a paper, I think in 1913 in New York, he said, this technology is far too scary. It would be really, really, really ungentlemanly and underhand to pop up in a submarine and start torpedoing ships. It's not how warfare should look like.
Yeah.
Here's a man who invented the atomic bomb, if you like, and he just thought, well, we can't use it. It's just far too ungentlemanly. And he said, well, we can use it. You can pop up to scare people away, but you should never fire a torpedo. And he went as far as saying, submarines should be used for transatlantic travel underneath the wave base where things were quieter, where you could still play snooker and have a brandy and a cigar. That's where submarine technology was going as far as he was concerned. How wrong was he? But those three projects for me, I think, encapsulate life-changing step changes in engineering. And for me, they sort of epitomize the awards and how we give awards and how we look at innovation, how we look at historical events, historical relationships, and that's that sort of lays at the heart of the Heritage Awards, Engineering Heritage Awards. And of course, they are open to the public. They are on display. The story continues. It continues to inspire people, visitors, and maybe just if one person visits one of our awards and is inspired to become an engineer, it's done its job.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are beautiful plaques, aren't they? They do get an official plaque that goes on the outside of wherever it is. And I loved your story there of the submarines, having worked on the Astute class submarine and also visiting the Holland. I've been to visit that, but also the submarines that were developed in the one-seaters that were developed in the American Civil War, which is so there's a wonderful history there. And I've seen the preservation that's been done to at least one of those very early 1860s submarines that most of the men who piloted them died during that. But the technology that went on into the Holland and then, of course, into the Astute. So there's a whole history there, again, that needs preserving.
The naval architecture, the quintessentially the shape of Holland 1 is exactly the same as the Astute class.
Yeah.
It's a natural form of a porpoise or a whale. It works. If it works in wildlife, it'll work, And that it leads me on. I mean, we were so lucky. We were asked to complete a project on a German one-man submarine, a Biber class submarine, and Biber class were built at the latter end of the Second World War to counteract the Royal Navy's use of the X-craft, who were doing really good things, and from conception to launch of the first Biber class submarine was 6 months. And what they did was that the Germans took existing automotive technology they were using on the front line in their trucks and wagons, and they put an Opel Blitz internal combustion engine into the Biber class submarine, not really thinking about the effects of carbon monoxide on the person piloting it. But these submarines were one-way missions, and they just didn't come back. They didn't record one kill. I think they built sort of 300 or more in the class and didn't get one kill during the war. But we were given one to play with, and we did a programme with Channel 4 and also working with apprentices at the Royal Dockyard in Portsmouth. And here we took 4 very young apprentices, put them on the front line, put them in front of a TV camera, and we deconstructed this Beaver submarine. We rebuilt it to running condition, operational condition, and we put it in the water and we played with it. And it was piloted by a very experienced rescue pilot, midget submarine rescue pilot working for the Royal Navy. And he just said that the technology, albeit incredibly crude and very basic, the functionality of the submarine was better than his current multi-million-pound submarine. and working with a naval architect friend of mine, we proved that the design of the submarine itself was far superior to those of our X-craft. But because they didn't work out that you're going to get killed breathing the fumes of internal combustion engine, had they sorted that one out, that would have been a very formidable piece of warfare equipment. But all the history books record the Beaver class as being a miserable failure.
Yeah.
Whereas through an industrial engineering, through a conservation engineering project supported by TV company and the Royal Navy and the Royal Navy Submarine Museum, we were able to not disprove, but we were able to rework that whole history and actually come up with the fact that it was a good piece of engineering. So
fantastic. Now, in my opening introduction, I talked briefly about our own building and the debate of whether or not we should preserve it. Now, I'm not going to ask you to unpick that very complex debate, Ian, but more broadly, I wanted to ask you about why we should protect our heritage structures, not just those that are already aged, but objects that are relatively new today. Should we be protecting them now for future generations? I kind of think that you've touched on this already, but perhaps we could explore that a little bit more.
There's many parts to your question, Helen, and some are very, very salient within this wider conversation. How buildings are chosen, or how buildings are selected, or how buildings survive is sometimes by luck, sometimes by fortune, sometimes by a passion or a need. Some have functional needs. Some have functional reasons why or operational reasons why they survive. But looking back through history, why we chose to preserve so many ancient buildings or historic buildings, we'll never know. There are landmark buildings, and Birdcage Walk is one of those. Landmark buildings survive because they are viewed as having a significant contribution or recognition within the built environment. And certainly Birdcage Walk is part of the fabric of Westminster. It's always been there, not always, but it's been there a long time. And it's one of those iconic buildings you walk past and think, I wonder what happens in there.
Yeah,
that looks very important building in there. And the reason I guess most people think it's important is because it's the way it's constructed. And those people that haven't been lucky enough to go inside Birdcage Walk, the exterior is a wonderful facade, but the interior is also incredibly important and wonderful. So buildings are, I guess, selected because of what they do and what they are and what they look like. And of course, we've got to remember we have lost so many iconic buildings over the years, certainly through the 1950s and 1960s. Let's just say a huge amount of industrial buildings went. So we're looking at a lot of pumping stations, textile mills, factories, a lot went. Why did they go? Because they were connected to an industry, possibly. Maybe that industry became defunct. Maybe that industry moved on. Maybe that industry modernized, and that type of building was not suitable for emerging technologies. When I think about the Cornish tin mines, the steam engine was far more valuable in the building, and you took the steam engine out and you put it somewhere else. Yeah. Once you exhausted that mine, you moved the engine, left the building up. We knocked a hole out the front of it, took the engine out, and off you went down the cliff and built a new mine. So that building got left behind, and some obviously do survive, and that's wonderful that we've got those buildings left. Other big buildings, like where you had big steam engines and certainly beam engines, they were house built, so it was very difficult to remove because the beam engine was built first, the buildings was enveloped around it. So when they got taken out, the buildings got taken down, and they got lost. So how we choose the future, that will be left to society. That will be left to a wider discussion between architects, cultural historians, the public. Hopefully, will be part of that debate. Us as engineers will be part of that debate. But why should we preserve them? Well, if I can give you just a very updated, sort of very new sort of analogy here, we might put it in perspective to people and sort of maybe prompt a wider discussion or wider debate about what we do with historic buildings. If you look at something like Windsor Castle, York Minster, both of which had awful, devastating fires, it was decided that they would be rebuilt, replicated, refurbished, brought back to not their original condition, but to something similar, something close to their original condition. They were brought back because they were iconic buildings connected to the church and or the monarchy, and steeped in history and play a significant, much wider role in education, tourism, culture, heritage, huge wide picture. And I guess they are obvious choices of why you would maybe conserve or preserve an historic building. And they're still used, like Birdcage Walk. It's a functional building. It's not. It hasn't outgrown its use. It still is our spiritual home. And although there are changes afoot to Birdcage Walk, and it will move into its next generation, its next being as a building. But I wanted to just touch on Clarendon House, which was built for the Onslow family in the 1720s. It was probably one of the best examples of Palladian mansion in the country, and it was given to the National Trust in 1956. That was devastated by fire in 2015, and I have been lucky enough to work on that project with the National Trust, trying to unpick that building and how it might look in the future. And they've been in a state of debate since 2015 about how we should go about that. Not us, but how society, how National Trust should address what is an historic building. It's now been completely destroyed with very little left. Now, the obvious route would be to do a similar approach to maybe Windsor Castle or York Minster or other buildings that have been affected by fire. So this question has sort of two aspects to it. So with regard to Birdcage Walk, quickly, if we want to retain the historic facade, if we want to retain the historic interior, if we want to maybe modernise within that scope of works, but predominantly leave what is the original fabric and work with that and integrate into a new modern concept for what Birdcage will look like in the future. You're working with historic materials, you're working with historic methods, and you require traditional skills and traditional materials to enable you to be able to repair, refurbish, and indeed maybe change the look of Birdcage Walk.
Yeah.
So you need the skills to do that. As we look at, as IMechE looks at modernising and upgrading the Birdcage Walk, there will be challenges ahead. All the major stakeholders, but moreover, all the key personnel who will be involved with the physical challenge that will present. So yes, we will need people that are very skilled at using traditional skills to address things like roofing, rainwater goods, brickwork, windows, joinery, all that type of stuff. But there's also a need to have an engineer or an engineering group on board with the project who should be and will be consulted about how that building needs to be unpicked. And this wouldn't necessarily just apply to our friends next door as structural engineers. This would also apply to mechanical engineering as well, because there are going to be lots of mechanical engineering issues, whether it be heating and ventilation, whether it be lifting arrangements within the building. There will be historic metal, there will be historic structures within there, there will be historic ironwork. There will be all sorts of mechanical engineering challenges that will come up. And the discussion will have to be had as to how we deal with all those challenges and how we integrate it into a modern scheme going forward.
Yeah.
So there's a need to appreciate more than just the physical attributes and more than just the structural attributes of Birdcage Walk. We need to also address and be familiar with the conservation side of it as well. the conservation questions that would need to be had as to what we retain, why we're going to retain it, how we're going to retain it, and how we're going to integrate it. And within that scope, there are many questions to be had, and to have engineers on board who have an affinity, have a connection with conservation in its broadest terms, but certainly specific to Birdcage Walk would be incredibly important. But going back to Clarendon House, here you have now a burnt out shell, no roof, everything gone, just brick walls standing now, and you have this incredibly strange image of fireplaces suspended 4 floors up, just hanging there.
Yeah.
Sculptures in ingle nooks that are just teetering, and everything's arrested and everything's now stabilized. And, I said at the time, I was asked about the future, not at high level, but just as a conservator working on the property and within the property for National Trust, I was part of that early discussions, and I maintain that the fire, however devastating, it has provided a unique and special opportunity, to deconstruct the heart of that historic building, with a forensic eye and sort of regenerate the architecture using a powerful mix of conservation, restoration, and technical innovation. And this will be really exciting, and it will generate learning opportunities for heritage craft skills, which can only be a good thing.
Yeah.
So there you have a historic building laid bare. You're seeing the heart of the construction that you would never normally see in a refurbishment, or restoration, even a conservation project of a historic building. It's never stripped back that bare, stripped back raw, where you can actually see the skeleton. You can see how it's put together. You can see all the inner workings. So this provides an amazing opportunity. And at Clarendon, they will work closely with experienced conservators, heritage craft skills. They'll work with engineers, whether it be mechanical, whether it be civil, structural. There'll be a massive mix of people there, architects, all working together to create a new vision for an historic building. A building that has been assessed as devastated, stripped out, lost all its soul, but it hasn't. That can come back. So there's no real comparison between the two, IMechE, Birdcage Walk, or Clarendon House, except they're both historic buildings. But this is the two extreme ends of two buildings and their life and where they are now. One's looking for hope, and one's looking for change. And all those elements brought together within conservation, with the unnerving confidence of engineers, we can put the soul back into a building that has very little left, or regenerate new energy within an existing building and for future engineers. So it's exciting. I mean, one thing that sort of springs to mind, if I can, which I think is very interesting, is the fact that you quite rightly move the conversation towards the built environment, because you have heard of the term historic buildings and conservation in the same conversation.
Yeah.
We talked earlier on about the disconnect between engineering and conservation, and why that might be, and why that might continue to be. Whereas conservation and the built environment come together naturally for some reason. We've all heard of it. We all know about historic buildings. And that led me to be thinking why that might be the case. And it soon became very apparent to me, and this is many, many years ago, having thought about this and talked about it and written about it, is the fact that if you look at the major stakeholders in the cultural sector, the two biggest cultural stakeholders, so it would be English Heritage, Historic England, or National Trust. They have a huge portfolio of historic buildings, thousands of buildings. And you look at historic churches and look at Royal Historic Palaces, there's a huge challenge there. We can see this challenge unfolding now. And I know you've been very interested in this particular project, Houses of Parliament. A very, very complex group of buildings. If you think Birdcage Walk is complicated, Palace of Westminster is off the scale. Yeah. So the challenges they're having there with degrading materials, and all the infrastructure within all needs to be renewed, regenerated. And there will be engineers there working very closely at every level of every decision making. So we have in this country this wonderful eclectic mix of historic buildings, and we have a group of custodians and stakeholders who are very proactive, wanting to make sure that these buildings are preserved and continue to provide a use. To do that, you need to have a huge skills base of people who are able to apply their specific trades to a particular project. So we are organically, with the help and with the enthusiasm of the major stakeholders, including government, to grow this skills base. So again, if you wanted to become a conservation bricklayer or conservation stained glass window conservator or thatch roof or lead working, there are learning opportunities out there.
Yeah.
And you can obtain a qualification, and you can apply your trade, and you can apply your learning and experience and knowledge to maintaining, to preserving, conserving historic buildings. And that has to be a great thing. That has to be a really good thing. But I think we've just illuminated what the challenge is. There is a perceived need, there is an appetite to conserve historic buildings, like Birdcage Walk, like Clarendon House. So you need to grow, and you need to invest in a future skills base to do that, because we've made a decision that these historic buildings are very important to our society, to the fabric of our society, on all many levels. And we've decided, we've taken that decision to provide opportunities for people to learn and to grow skills to undertake those tasks. My question would be, why is mechanical engineering or industrial heritage possibly viewed in a marginal way? This is something that vexes me, something I can't come to terms with, and something I want to be able to be part of. I want to be able to elevate the discussion, and this opportunity, this interview with you today, has provided a wonderful platform for me to start that discussion, maybe, or restart that discussion.
Yeah.
So that I think is incredible. I think your question there has really opened or closed the debate. Beautiful, actually, because it's a lovely segue from where we started to where we came to. And I think that comparison between the built environment and mechanical engineering, there is a disconnect. And I can't explain why there's a disconnect, but it's something I'd like to be part of to try and mend.
Yeah. Well, perhaps that leads me to my final question, Ian, actually, because I guess your role kind of sits on this pivot, doesn't it, between constantly needing to apply new technology and skills to preserve older structures and objects. So looking at the future, I guess, what are your hopes for conservation engineering as a profession? I'll say that in inverted commas. And what do you feel engineers could learn from the past to create innovative solutions for the future?
Well, my passion, my wish would be that we could provide learning opportunities for engineers or for anybody starting out a career, or even maybe moving into a different career, but to provide opportunities for people to learn learn about conservation engineering and what that means in the context we just been talking about, but provide a codified platform where people can have the opportunity to either upskill, because there's a need for people to upskill, and an opportunity for people to grow to become maybe to a position where I've become, which is afforded the opportunity to provide the level of expertise and support that the sector does require and will require in the future. How we get there is something we talked about during the course of this interview, but we do need to continue the conversation. We do need to grow the debate, and we need to find solutions before it's too late. There is, of course, there's a counter discussion, which is that in the future, going forward, will we view conservation engineering in the same way I view it today, in the way we've been discussing, the way it's been part of my life for nearly 50 years? Is that something that will stand the test of time? Will there be the same requirement or the same perceived requirement I have for conservation engineers in the future? That will only be defined and influenced by how we as a society view conservation engineering, and that's part of that whole debate. I guess, Helen, I would be so happy if there was an opportunity for an individual or individuals to experience to some degree what I've experienced in my lifetime. So a love of engineering, yes. A love of cultural heritage, yes. An opportunity to engage with the past, but in a positive way.
Yeah.
Add value to maybe an object or a site that has been left to decay, and re-energize that site and use engineering as that vehicle to do so. That would be really exciting. That's a huge, huge challenge, and we are, in compared to the built environment, we are many, many, many years behind because attitudes need to change. If indeed, as a society, we believe they should.
Yeah.
It's not a given. It's not a given. As I touched on earlier, every single year now, we are completely losing, in other words, extinct heritage craft-based skills.
Yeah.
Because once there is no more need for a skill or a process or an object, once we reverse engineer an object or a process out of society, it's gone forever. And with certain trades and certain disciplines which are disappearing so quickly, if there are no opportunities to keep that skill alive, to proliferate those learning opportunities, it will be lost forever. And that's a decision we have to take. And that possibly is a debate the next generation will have, or the emerging generation will have. But we have to assist in that debate now before it's too late. And I mean, pivoting between constantly needing to apply new technology and skills to preserve ever older structures and objects. Well, that's interesting because I always remember having a conversation with an eminent engineer many, many, many years ago, and I was getting carried away about traditional way of doing things by hand, doing things by eye, using a rivet, making it hot, setting the rivet, and being absolutely inspired by what it does and being part of that process. And this chap just turned around to me, and this was over a pint, and he sort of said, "Do you not think if James Watt had glue, he wouldn't use it?" And of course he's right. Engineering adhesives, we use them every single day.
Yeah.
So although as an engineer, emerging technology, emerging construction methods and materials excite me, and sometimes you really want to use them.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to remind yourself you're in a position where you're doing a project, you're working for a client, and their aspiration, their given is that you will use traditional materials, traditional fasteners, and do it in a traditional method. So no, we don't put a bolt in something that should be riveted.
Yeah.
No, we don't use glue when it should be welded, or whatever the case might be. So looking forward, it's quite an intriguing question, because the future conservation engineers, if a discipline has gone, you have to replace it with something. So unless we do invest in preserving traditional skills, we will have to revert to using modern methods, which is kind of sad.
Yeah.
Because if you've got a thatch roof and you want a thatch roof, you're not going to put a tile roof on. But if there's no thatches, thatch roofs are gone forever.
Yeah.
And you have to revert to tiles or slates or something different. But that will never be. I'm convinced that will never be. Where I live in the south of England, we have so many thatchers now, and that pool of skills has grown dramatically over the last 25 years, which tells you that there are learning opportunities for thatchers working in the built environment, because that discussion has been had and that discussion has been made. So there's a case in point. So I would despair to think that we can't put a hot set rivet in 50 years' time, 100 years' time. I'm hopeful that the preserved railways, amongst others, will keep that skill alive and pass it on to the next generation. So hopefully it will be protected. But you're right, Helen, that it is a pivot point. We are sitting between two. We're on a bridge here between two different paths, and how we go about that, how we address that, is all part of this wider discussion. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting because I'll give you a really good case in point. let's just say a client is insisting we use like-for-like materials and like-for-like design. So if you take a simple thing such as a simple nut on a structure, and we have 1,000 missing on a particular structure, and we know for a fact that this particular nut is 1/2 inch Whitworth and it's square, and the client says to me, please replace all these fixings exactly like for like. Delighted to. And you give them a cost for that, and they basically say, that seems to be very high. How have you come to that? Surely a nut can't cost that amount of money. And then you say to them, well, we are not producing many 1/2 inch Whitworth square nuts anymore. And we want them to be square because that is the period design before hexagonal nuts came in as commonplace. We're not using Whitworth threads much these days, although of course we are still using them, and Americans still use them in a different form. So the client says, well, how much would it cost to put a hexagonal M12 nut in the same place? And the price is considerably less. And then suddenly you have this dilemma, which is cost driven, which is, do we go for what we should be using, which is 10 times the price of what we shouldn't be using? But because we've got limited funds on a limited project, we're going to revert to the metric hexagonal nuts. You could argue it provides the same function, the same stability, same tensile strength. But when that project is viewed in 100 years' time, if I put myself 100 years hence and I'm looking at this job on a survey because the structure's rusting, and I say, oh, look, they were using M12 hexagonal nuts in 1850. No, they weren't.
Yes.
So we do have a responsibility to our historic structures. We do have a responsibility within conservation engineering to understand what we're trying to do, what we're trying to say, and what message we're trying to leave behind. We don't want to leave a false trail.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we do leave a false trail, documentation has to make that very explicit. So there are responsibilities, lovely caveats within that, and a lovely question. And it's something that the next generation will have fun with.
Well, I think that's a great point to end the interview, Ian, and quite rightly, this is a discussion point that I think hopefully listening to this podcast today, people will feel the need to go away and discuss this, and we have a great opportunity as an engineering community to really drive forward the preservation of this incredible history. We always talk about, as engineers, standing on the shoulders of giants. And indeed, in our 175th anniversary year, that this is a great opportunity to not only look forward to the technology that we have not even imagined yet, but to look back and preserve the incredible technology that's got us to where we are today. And I think that's great. Ian, thank you so much for joining me on today's show. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to your stories and the passion with which you present this particular field of engineering. Thank you.
It's been great fun. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Helen.
That's all for this month. In next month's show, we will be speaking with some of our international members as part of another 2-part episode about global energy consumption, sustainable opportunities to address the climate crisis, and how China and India are facing significant challenges to ensure they protect their environments and their people. You've been listening to Impulse to Innovation, the Institution of Mechanical Engineers podcast. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear from you, so if you'd like to share any news or any feedback with us, then please email us, podcast@imeche.org. All the information on this episode can be found in the episode notes.